Hey Roshni, how you doing?
Hi, Philip. I'm doing well, thank you.
Good. What is it dark outside there?
Yes,
What time?
it's 7:30 in the evening.
7 in the evening. Oh my goodness me. Maybe I should show you where, I don't know if you can see where Lisa is. She's just behind this column over there. Can you wave, Lisa? No, I can't see her. She's hidden.
You can see me on my camera, right?
Yeah. Try again. Try again. There. Oh, I can just see you in the distance. Do you see her? She's pretty much at the center of the screen. Do you see that now? Oh, good. Miss Bell's here too. Hey, Marisabel.
Hi. Sorry, I'm late.
Absolutely shocking. Hey there, Ivy. Well, it feels like we can get going. Oh, good. Louis is here as well. That's great. Okay, so I do think that there are enough of us so that we can start. So hi everyone. Thank you for a really wonderful first day. I came away from it just really charged up with it, just the sense that like it really felt like everyone was present in the call. I really enjoyed seeing your faces and your expressions. So we've got 4 things that I hope we can do in the next 2.5 hours. One is that I'm hoping that we can do a go around where you show a bit of your own work. Really love to see that. Do folks have that kind of thing available? Is that okay? The next is to look at the Miro boards and to see the work in progress. Not everyone has posted, but there's some really beautiful things up there. Actually, I should have said there are 5 things. So a go around where you show your own work, looking at work in progress on the Miro board. I'm going to give the next assignment, which is noted very briefly already on Basecamp, describing how to develop this work further. Maybe I'll start with that actually. And then Lisa has a presentation, and so do I. Mine's a little bit long, and we'll see how far we get because it could be spaced out, and it could be done on Thursday as well. Okay, so I wonder if we could just, has everyone had a chance to look at the Miro board? Maybe I wonder whether I should share my screen and just go there right now. Or actually, Lisa, would you be up for doing that?
Yep, I can do that.
Thank you so much. Okay, so let's just survey it together to take a look. Now, one of the nice things about Miro is that you can see other people looking. So what I'm going to suggest now is that everybody go to Miro individually while we stay on Zoom, so that then we can also see everyone looking around. Okay, just want to have that exercise because it's a rather effective one with Miro.
Was everybody able to log in and they can see also the Zoom screen, the mirror board on the Zoom screen?
Mhm.
Okay, great. Shall we just, do you want to start from the top then, Philip?
Well, what I wanted to do was I just wanted to do the go around first.
Sure.
Before we do the crit. I'm really glad to see everything here. Thank you so much for that. And I just wanted to make sure that that everyone can also see each other moving around. For example, can you see me? Okay, yeah, okay, it's working. All right, so let's do the go around then as the next step. And the idea here is that each person in turn just share a few images of their work so we can get to know each other a little bit more. Victoria, do you want to start?
Yes, I can start.
And
Should
you-
I share my screen or will
Yeah,
everyone look at my report?
I think it's absolutely fine for each person to share their screen in turn.
Okay, great. So just give me 1 second. Perfect. So I had actually 2 ideas that I developed. The first one was taken from my leftover PLA filament that I can't use because it's low quality, and I was thinking all the time, like, how can I use it in a way?
Oh,
So
I'm so sorry, Victoria. Please
Yeah.
forgive me. What I had in mind was that
Mhm.
I was just checking the mirror to make sure that everyone had access to it. But what I had in mind was a go around, like what we're going to do is we're going to look at all of the work for sure. But
Mhm.
first of all, yesterday we had talked about the possibility of showing a little bit, just a little bit of things that people have done themselves. In other words, preceding work, like what things that you are working on, your own portfolio.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Let me ask, do people have that prepared? Is that easy to do? Just
Might I, could I do that on Thursday? I completely forgot about that and I don't have it prepared right now.
okay.
Is that okay? I'm
Well,
sorry.
no, it's absolutely fine. And are other people in that state as well, where would it be more comfortable to do that on Thursday? If we kind of like prepared a bit of a show and tell about our own personal things for Thursday, would that be more comfortable? Okay, I see 2 or 3 people nodding. Okay, so let's say we're going to do that then. We're going to just do a little reset. So the show and tell, which is not the design work in progress, but rather, what we've been doing personally in our own lives, in our own practices. We're going to get to know each other, right? We can do that on Thursday. Sound good? Okay, we'll do that. Okay, well, in that case, then, absolutely, yes. Let's definitely jump into this round. Now, I'm planning on us taking about an hour for this, and so there are, let's say, nine people presenting, and so that means we have about 6 minutes each, something like that. In other words, it's fairly short, but it's still enough to have a look at things. So I'll just ask for people to think in those terms of a fairly brief check-in. Let's have confidence that it's really the collective, by looking over the shoulders at each other's work also, which will really help move this along. Now, I'm just going to do some signposting before we do that, because what I want to do is share where we're going with this design exercise. So what I hope we will be able to do is, At the end, on Friday, my hope is that each of you will have a physical model of samples and some images that really create a sense of a personal veil that makes a space. And I'm hoping that garment space fabric will have some rather special qualities that you'll be able to speak to as well. And it can be accompanied by other images, inspirations, words. So it's a cluster of material. It's like a launch of a way of working. It's an experimental space. The center of it then is a composition. The edges are studies and words and other images and inspirations. Along the way, the assignment for today I'm going to give you is to broaden and deepen this in very particular ways. Up to now, you've assembled things with many pieces and created a fabric and created a periodic tessellation. And you've been thinking a bit about precarity and reactivity, the kind of qualities that we've been speaking about. We'll be talking about this when we look at each study. Now, I'm going to ask you to do a couple of very specific things, and we'll reiterate this after we look at the work in progress, but I just want to float it for you now. First of all, the fabric wants to become more complex by adding a second repeating element, a second kind of thing. So then it's going to be a relationship of at least two different kinds of periodicities. When I say periodicity or period, I just mean repeating elements, cellular, assembling, weaving together. Next, I'm going to ask you to create pretty significant density with it. And that may mean multiplying it more. Enough so that it can acquire an immersive kind of quality. So the first thing is make it more complex by adding pieces. The second is to increase the density and multiply. The third is to organize that a bit more by thinking about groups of groups of groups. At least those three scales. Groups of groups of groups. And I'm going to ask you to define that any way you wish. That's a pretty significant practice in the studio, actually, because we find that we kind of flatline when we just have a homogeneous, dense array of a single kind of thing. And it takes a certain kind of organization, you know, like what scale are we working at? What topology are we working at? And it's very helpful to think about groups of groups of groups. But we'll take a light hand on that, and I'm going to ask you to offer that for yourself. The next thing I'm going to ask you to do is to create some sense in which the organizations in what you're creating fly apart and fragment and become dissolute and lose their coherence in some regions. Test the limits of letting this just evaporate, dissolve. Let's experience that experience of dissolution. By contrast, I'm also going to ask you to tighten this and crystallize it and make it much more precise in some regions so that the order is just exquisitely tuned. So what you can hear me do in this fourth step is to create a kind of a spectrum of organization and entropy as well in this. Both the kind of coherence and also the deliberate discoherence where we open and we fray and we collapse. And I'm by no means suggesting that one should be at the center and the other should be at the edge. I'm not sure if you got images from what I was just saying, but if you were thinking crystalline order and then it all frays out, well, yes, that could be a way to do it, but that's by no means the request. It could be the inverse of that. a frame with an extraordinarily free kind of emergent sandbox, which is deliriously open in the center, or it could be a periodic cycling waffle with different regions and landscapes where one or the other of those qualities, order and disorder, and are not at all prioritized or privileged. They're an open question. I have a feeling that will result in some political discussions, like what kind of world really nourishes us? What kind of edges and centers do we really need? Are satisfying? And then finally, I'm going to ask you, well, actually, there's a couple more steps. I'm next going to ask you to place an explicit human scale in this material by putting in a figure, by thinking of this as a fabric, which would be a house, an enclosure, a nest, a dress, a bed, a canopy, a patch, a small badge, a mask for a being, for a human being. You can do that by using imagery. You could take a photograph of the material directly to your own body. It's your choice about how to do that, but introduce this human scale and make it consequential. You're creating a world. And then the sixth step is to liberally include other images and inspirations in order to create a whole lookbook that is to say kind of a collection that where you're not earning your way with every step by fabricating or composing. You're just saying, it could be like this, could be like this, could be like this, and gather together in a constellation. And it'll be very interesting with your more developed work that happens after today to have a kind of a sharper, more precise association with those possibilities. Does that give you a feeling for where we might go over the next day or so? And so, because we have a break tomorrow, this also gives quite a chance. I'm giving a fairly rigorous. This is real strong development, so that then on Thursday we could have really quite strongly developed fabrics and concepts as well. Okay, so I've just said that now. I'll reiterate it, or at least we can open the base camp and look at the notes after this. But this is just to keep in mind. In other words, okay, where are we going with this? Please have that sense as we go through this go around. Okay, cool. So let's jump in then. Victoria, if you could share your screen, that'd be great.
Yes. Perfect. So, yeah, as I already mentioned before, I started with my leftover filament that I can't use. And I cut it into smaller pieces and then deformed it into half circles in order to arrange it in a way that I can create a more flat fabric. And then I experimented with two different kinds of connection parts. So first I tried to connect 4 pieces always together. I just used regular sticky tape for that. And I created like a fabric that, let's see what this is, or yeah, you can see it on the Miro board that, it's up here, but it was rather open and see-through. So I tried to create a higher density by arranging 8 parts together, as you can see in the second example. And once I arranged it, I created a more dense structure. And then I also experimented to put it on my body and see what kind of shapes it creates. Sort of like a rounded neck or shoulder part. And due to the half circles not being completely fully 180 degrees when I bend the filament, the fabric itself isn't flat like I intentionally tried to achieve, but it has a curvature, which I think is actually very potential to create, a 3-dimensional shape. So here on the camera, you can see how this piece behaves. It has also an interesting two-faced sides. So when you look at it from this side, it looks completely different as if you arrange it maybe on the other side. So I was experimenting with that, but at the same time, I was also following the second idea, which is a little bit more time consuming, and therefore I think I won't be able to fulfill it, but I think it's still an interesting approach, and I'd like to present it to you. It's a 3D text box. What you do is you print on a normal printer a 2D pattern, and you print it on a pre-stretched fabric. And once you release the tension of the fabric, the shape jumps into a three-dimensional shape. And I printed these octagonal structures, as you can see here on the left. This is a different example, but the pattern that I printed, you can see now on the camera, is something like this. And then once the fabric is released, it jumps into these these shapes. And I was thinking, like, how can I connect these shapes together? And I designed a connector that is also 3D printed. So once I have one of these pieces, I can connect it on multiple ends with each other. And I managed to print 3 pieces because each piece takes 1.5 hours to print. I'm really sad about that. I think I won't be able to print 200 pieces in time, but I think it can create a really interesting pattern, because if you look closely, this shape can really jump into different forms. And I also made a little video that I unfortunately can't put on, I can't put it on the Miro board, but here you can see how the shape really changes depending on if you push it inwards or outwards in the middle part. And this is what I've been thinking about so far.
I'm just going to share my screen, just so I can comment a little bit more easily on this. There, can you see me now opening and closing? Thank you so much for sharing this. When I look at this, I find myself thinking about a couple of things. I mean, one in terms of the filament and textile locking. Are you printing a filament pattern and then stretching the fabric over that and then locking it by printing on the other side, or are you printing only on one side?
No, I'm
Cool.
printing on 2 sides.
Okay, cool. Yeah, it's a really lovely thing to do. I'm with you on that. I want to suggest maybe exploring the bare filaments a little bit more, because what I'm seeing is the potential for an incredibly interesting three-dimensional kind of foam to be developed, and I really love the quick technique of, you might consider just chopping up some flexible tubing, for example, and then chopping up a number of filament lengths. I mean, just so that so that you have a nice stable set. My eyes suggest that the tubing might want to be formed into a full loop rather than just a 90 degree turn, because if you made a full loop, then you could make continuous waffles where you gather multiple different pieces together. In other words, if you think of the tubes as nodes and then loops going between, so you're always connecting to another node. And if you just crimped the filament so it was always making at least a U, then I think you could make a very satisfying waffle. And what's on my mind about that is to consider working with a periodic array in which it's not only a quadrilateral or a triangular system, but rather a hyperbolic system. I mean, for example, if you started with 6 nodes coming together, I mean, or 3 nodes coming together, then you would have like a three more particularly, then you would have a beautiful hexagonal mesh. But then you could try dropping and adding links to that, folding it into a pentagonal cell, or expanding it into a septagonal cell, a seven-sided cell. And either way, that will warp the fabric one way or shrink it the other. And if you shrink it, it'll make it into it'll start the surface of a sphere. And then it will become, you could do it in the other direction. And that I think that hyperbolic exploration of a space waffle could be really, really rewarding. Now that's a slightly different direction than the second one, in which you're focusing on the membrane and its relationship to the filament, which I think is also just fascinating. It's just that it's necessarily a different speed of work. And I have a feeling that there's some really strong work that could be done with this waffle system. If you got a stability into it, I mean, through the aperiodic hyperbolic mode, then I think you could try to go in three-dimensional as well, in which you start stacking up those layers and start constructing a three-dimensional foam beyond the waffle. Do those suggestions make sense?
Yes, I will try to do it.
I love it. I mean, it looks like just by forming, I mean, if you've got a source of filament, and so that's quite easy to put those together. Do you have any fastening? I mean, how are you fastening them right now? Is it tape?
Yes, I think so.
Do you have access to any tubing or anything where you could push it in and gather it together?
Yeah, I can look in the normal.
Or do you have a hot glue gun?
No, but I could get one.
Okay, well, I mean, hot glue guns are our friends. I mean, like hacking arrays so very quickly. That might be a very satisfying way. Of course, you can melt them together too if you. I mean, but that will be a little bit slower. You could most certainly just use a lighter or a little torch, which would be kind of beautiful, but you'll probably burn yourself. I mean, I have so many scars on my hands. Beautiful work. Thank you. Maybe I'll tell you what, I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to keep on sharing my screen. And I wonder whether Hanan, are you here? Oh, Hanan is, yes. Hanan, talk to us about yours.
Yeah, sorry, I needed to unmute myself. So I was just, when we were talking about materials, I was looking outside and seeing maple trees. So I started looking at using these kind of maple airplane things as material. So I originally wanted to make a more structured grid, and I was working on like sewing them together using wire, and it was very time consuming and falling apart to make kind of this more what would you call it, like simple more spread apart grid. And so that was falling apart. So then I decided that I wanted to do something quicker and that would stay together. So I started densely stapling them together to kind of create a structure. So yeah, that's what I did.
It's incredibly beautiful, and I love this, just the sequence of the study where we see this roughly accumulating and then a periodic array or a waffle emerge, and then this study of them overlapping. And I guess this one in particular, where it seems like we're really starting to see something condense. Do you have any reaction to the staple going through the heart of each of the maple seeds? Is that an expressive form, or what's your hunch about that?
I mean, initially I was very delicately sewing. I mean, if you scroll up to, I think, the picture above, I was very delicately sewing with wire
Oh,
them
right.
together, and it was tearing apart, and very time consuming. Um, so when I was thinking about structural stability, I was thinking, well, the most structural stable part the of it is the heart. Um, so by pressuring the heart, I guess, of one of them and locking it with kind of the tail of the others, it actually held together. Um, but yeah, there's kind of a certain violence to be like slamming a stapler through the central portion. Um,
I mean, I react ambivalently to this because I find it incredibly expressive and also quite violent. I mean, quite intense. For the heart of each of these quasi beings to be pierced this way, and I think that could be, a source of great satisfaction if it's done deliberately. I get what I'm observing though is that a maple key. I'm blessed with being surrounded by maple trees and having maple keys around me as part of my life, actually. um, a maple key has a couple of different, quite distinct parts, doesn't it? That is to say that the paired winged seeds, but also this stem. And
Yeah.
there's a very stable kind of dimension, where it breaks off, at the branch, and then where it is quite nicely bound to the two seeds, and it needs to be, because that's what gives it its helicopter shape, helicopter motion when it falls through the air and acquires the spiral through the air. And so I would suggest considering that twig, that nice resilient twig, as being an element in its own right, and maybe not separating it from the seeds and the wings, but maybe allowing the seeds and the wings to go along for the ride while you assemble a diagrid matrix of the stems alone. And maybe just, you could staple them, and assemble them, and then I suspect that the seeds and the wings would then stand a little bit up from the surface, maybe just coax them in order to make a very, very dense array, but that's a bit more free. And I have a feeling that the staples could be a little happier, just going right through the stem rather than through the seed above it. And I just think it would be a matter of just moving it a couple of millimeters down to the start of the body rather than right through the heart. Do you have a feeling for what I mean?
Yeah. So kind of the intersection, like right where the stem is connecting to
Yeah,
the heart.
that's
Um,
right. Like
using
here,
that
I'm
as that
like
location.
just like I suspect that location
Hmm.
and then that location, this and this, could be might be a very satisfying kind of array where then this flies free on
Yeah.
top of it. Now that's
Okay.
just a speculation anyway, Helen. I mean, I think this is incredibly interesting. I'm going to be very interested to see what you do in the next stage where you add another element too.
Yeah, there's actually another type of seed. I don't actually know what kind of tree it is. It may be a maple as well. That's here that I can't reach the I
Yeah.
can't reach the bundles of that I was really inspired by, but they're way
Mm.
high up, so I might try to figure out how to, I don't know, reach those branches, to incorporate a different type of seed.
You might consider putting two maple keys together and then pairing them with a staple, and that would set a little Y-shaped foot, and then you could try putting together those and into a continuous zigzag, where you have V's and then double keys and a V and double key and a V and a double key, and then that in turn then could very likely be attached to another row, and you could start setting up maybe it's almost the equivalent of this, but instead of those being separate, I'm wondering whether if you put this to this and brought those
kind of.
together, then you could have this happening.
Yeah.
And then that could then be attached to this one. And I have a feeling that it could set up a really, really strong coherent fabric where in the third dimension, you could just have this incredible projection of all of the seed material. So that would layer it and make it, it would kind of turn it into a three-dimensional stratum. Oh my goodness me, there's an awful lot that could be done with this.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really fun material, though very, very delicate at the same time.
I'm with you.
I liked your mention of hot glue because that was something that I thought about pulling out yesterday, and I may end up using as a way to bind because the staples in the metal just kind of can tear it in a way that is
Lisa, do you have any thoughts on other jointing methods for this material?
I don't know, maybe because we're combining now with another material, it might be interesting to start weaving it into, like, if the other material is a mesh, you could start weaving in the stems into the mesh as a possibility. Or yeah, so like it would be interesting for sure to try it with different seeds. But I think that if the connecting material has its own visual quality as well, you could have, like, because the staples and the hot glue both have their own visual quality, but if you start bringing in like a woven connector or a tie-off connector that really adds visually to the whole piece, that might be something to try also.
Yeah.
I don't know if I have like specific material to suggest off the top of my head.
When you say that, Lisa, it makes me think that maybe if you have a real generosity of maple keys and material on, and that maybe it would be okay to sacrifice a bunch and just rip off all the stems from a large group too, and then just deliberately make a grid work, a mesh work out of stems as a kind of scaffolding. And likewise, maybe allow the maple keys themselves to make their own kind of membrane as well. And then, if there's a reference to those two kind of more elemental fabrics, that might be a hint about then how to start combining them as composites. I have a feeling that each of those elements, both the seed with its wing and also the twig, those are incredibly interesting elements. And it might be interesting also to sacrifice even the double, and then just look at single, like, okay, here's a wing and a seed. That's a very powerful thing that you could really push. I have a feeling that maybe that even just to push it, the staple is its own kind of texture that might be a very expressive thing as well. And photography allows us to experience any of these things at very, very expressive scales. So I wouldn't hesitate to invest in some really intricate kind of fine qualities in this. If the intimacy of this demands that kind of encounter, then let it be so.
Or you could try daisy chaining it together. Like the daisy chains that you make when you're a kid, and you like cut open the stems, put them together like that.
Yeah.
Reza, tell us about yours.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Based on your lecture yesterday, I go out for finding the materials that has features like not expensive, resilience, recycled or recyclable, and availability was important for me. At the market, I found the egg boxes, and I see it very interesting for me because it had a three-dimensional shape, like a saloon. And when I cut the egg boxes, I found these parts very interesting for me, and I found it very good for having a pattern and a fabric like this, producing a fabric like this if we put together them in different way. And when I was working, I accidentally shaped one of them, cut one of them linear way. And after putting the linear parts like by this method and like this pattern, I found different patterns, and I think they can produce a fabric. I found three. I can make three of the three patterns, three different patterns. I should try more. I should change. I should cut the aspects of these parts, or maybe by cutting this hole and making it a hole like an eye, for example. I don't know. I should experience more on these patterns, but I love this material. I don't know what's your idea about this.
I absolutely love the sense that this is a fibrous material, cellular, which you can kind of unapologetically, liberally generate a fabric with. And so I think that your initial explorations here could really be pushed, and I love them. I mean, for example, maybe it would be interesting to cut a lot of individual cells. They're quadrilateral right now, and that's cool. You know, I mean, they're not close packed. I think that when we look at this, they're packed in a quadrilateral array, right? As when I say quadrilateral, I mean like where one thing is above the other, and if you shifted that like this, then you could experience close packing. And so it might be interesting to cut out individual cells, and then I think also similar to the comment to Victoria, once you have that array very freely organizing, it could make sense to try on some hyperbolic relationships. That is to say, where you add in, force in some elements, and then see how this could start to create a shifting waffle as well. You'll have to have quite a large number of things before that's satisfying. It'll just be messy. But I have a feeling
I bring 20 egg boxes for free.
Perfect, wonderful.
They could produce more of.
That's absolutely wonderful.
Yeah.
And
I found a big store, egg store, and he says every night we put them in trash. I said, okay, I want them, and I can bring them for free.
So, so like creating the periodic array in which they're locking together the way you're doing here is very, very interesting. And I would suggest I would build that up into quite like a large density. And then you could introduce, again, hyperbolic situations where you skip a beat, so that then let's say that there are 6 across the top, but you're forcing 5 into that same piece, and then you reheal it in the area around it, right? So you see a kind of a stutter in the organization. Now, if you do that in a very systematic way, then you will get kind of something like a growth algorithm. Like it's every row is 6 against 5, and you get an accelerating curvature. If you do it just occasionally, it can produce a billowing, and it's extremely interesting what starts to happen. But what it needs is a basic organization in which things are really, really kind of settled into an order. I think this is fabulous anyway. I mean, like this is going to be a really, really satisfying kind of fabric. I love it.
Okay. Nice to hear that.
Would it be possible to generate enough of this so that this could create quite an extensive membrane, which then starts to curl back on itself and create some hollows as well. I mean, I have a feeling that this could turn into a study in which if you generated enough in the fabric, that it hovers at the edge between being a membrane, but also the start of the shell construction as well. And I have a feeling that could be a very interesting outcome of working this way with a real generosity of material. Does that make sense? Can you picture that?
Yes,
that
yeah.
option?
Okay, I will try for next.
Cool, beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Shirin,
Yes. And for inspiration, I used the projects of Iranian artist Monir Farmanyan. She worked with geometries and triangles and mirrors, absolutely. And I want to use the triangle pattern to my project. And then I found the building material, plastic mesh and plastic washer, and I try to cut the plastic mesh to triangle pattern, and then I produced two type of pattern. That was one of them was linear moving, and another one was three-dimensional moving. And right.
this is really interesting because this is something that I struggle with all the time, Sharon. Lisa, maybe you'll identify with me, where we kind of hover between, okay, do we go for an immersive scale fabric, or do we go for quite carefully worked individual things and just feel great satisfaction in there being just a smaller number of them? And it requires kind of a choice between those things sometimes, because like you'll just kill yourself if you try to make many extremely elaborate things. Now, your joint structure is not elaborate, but it still requires just enough care so that it will be very difficult to make 1,000 of these things, right? And I wonder whether there is a way of experiencing the overall fabric, and just where the sweet spot would be in this, where we could have it both ways, where we could have this like lovely invention of the washer putting together this expanded three-dimensional waffle. I mean, I think it's a brilliant unit, and at the same time, just enough of it so that it could really turn into a fabric. This is right now a very interesting figure that is a small cluster of material. Do you have any thoughts about that? I mean, how long does it take each one of these units to be made?
1 hour, maybe take 2 minutes. I cut them, and then I cut the washers, and with hot glue connect them.
Got it.
Yes.
I see what you mean. Wow. So they have to be glued together and put together carefully. Yeah, I see what you mean.
For every module, I use 4 triangle mesh, and then connected with washers.
It's just I find this fascinating, like the question of just how to be able to sketch. Would you consider using a stapler or something like that instead of the washers, just in order to be able to put together, like, because these units are very beautiful. I wonder whether there would be a way of assembling them quite quickly.
Okay, I will try.
Any other ideas, Lisa? What do your eyes say about like ways to combine that would be easy?
I guess it's a little bit more fiddly than staplers, but you know, the jump rings that you use in jewelry, the metal jump rings might have like a similar quality to the washers, but you like open them with a pair of pliers and then connect whatever you need to and then twist them closed again. But try something like that. I think it's like an in-between between the washers and the stapler idea.
So
at
that's
the
a
time.
jump ring, eh? Like
Yeah.
jump rings, they're very cheap ones that are available from a craft store or a beading store they come offset like that.
Mhm.
And then you just have two pliers and you go and they go together and
I have it. I have.
do you have that material?
Yes, yes.
Very
Yes, I do.
cool.
Okay.
I have to confess that I love zip ties too. You know, I mean, the lightest kind of cable ties, and then you just clip off the end, and then it's a pretty efficient locking joint. I think that, you know, what I absolutely love in this is just this piece and the way you organize that. I think that's really a spectacularly beautiful element. So to my mind, like keeping going with that will be really wonderful. Love it.
Okay. Thank you.
Lauren, are you here?
Yes.
Hi, Lauren.
Hi. So I actually started building the model before like my inspiration kind of came towards the end. So I chose paper clips for my kind of found elements and started to make a model from there. And I originally had started like lining the paper clips up and kind of creating this internal structure where there's like 5 combined together. And then I started to combine those 5 into another and kind of seeing a reverse fractal kind of geometry. That's why my inspiration for came back to like fractals. And I think I might go back and actually have it a little bit more refined where the fractal geometry kind of starts to expand and create a geometry that way. So when it comes to the models that I had created, the first unit, you can kind of see it's like a chain like fabric that when it's expanded, you see a little bit more of the geometry that is being built, but when it's kind of compressed, it has this chain like feeling. And then I kind of started to expand it into different phases and kind of hanging it to kind of see the gravitational forces on it to kind of see how they would kind of react to gravity and if certain points are anchored, what kind of forms they would create. And afterwards, I created a second module for it and kind of combined it linearly. So they are 2 together. And then towards the end, I started to kind of look at it in 3 dimensionals to see if one of the pins, if they start to come out 3-dimensional, how it would start to look like. And then that is where I started to remember Gaudi's catenary model. And I'm hopefully kind of coming back to doing something similar to this, kind of creating this kind of catenary thing that kind of allows gravity to kind of create these forms that are being draped down onto it. And then at the end, I had just draped the material over my hand to kind of see how it goes, but I was a little bit more intrigued by the catenary structures and kind of creating this inverted dome kind of structures using the staples and possibly another material. I did realize that it is really hard to like create like a rigid structure around it. So my next exploration would kind of creating like a rigid form that everything will kind of be hung off of, and instead of being pinned to a wall in a sense. So it's a little bit more of a freestanding structure that gets these elements draped from.
Oh man, it's just absolutely delicious to look at this. The hanging chain structures and hanging thread structures are just absolutely fascinating. I wonder, have you looked at Fry Otto's historical hanging thread structures?
Not as yet.
So Fry Otto, for those of you who don't know them, at the mid-century German designer, FREIOTTO, the designer of the 1971 Munich Olympics, for example. And his studio in Stuttgart is now taken over by the successor, Achim Menges, the Institute for Computational Design, who's been doing really is doing something that really carries on that tradition. But if you look at Otto's Institute for Lightweight Structures, ILS, then you'll see just a whole wealth of publications, including things in bamboo and soap bubbles and mesh works and fabric studies. One of the things that he did was to set up hanging catenary chains like this, but starting with thread and many lines of thread and looping them together, and then using just like a framework or that would allow the thread to play, and then dipping it, and then seeing how things would clump together when the water introduces hydrogen bonding to it, and you get this incredible, interesting, very fractal like branching automated foam structures coming out of that look an awful lot like your intuitions about the paperclip. So you might enjoy working with thread, Lauren, or cords on and I would suggest that another key to that would be branches upon branches upon branches, you know, rather than one order of loops mirrored. It would be very interesting to see how there are loops upon loops upon loops. Maybe another way to do that is to take the kind of structures that you've already got going in the eclipse, but then load them with another element, similar to the way Gaudi was using the individual tiny little sandbags and you know, putting 1,000 little bags on them. That's a really effective way about seeing how both the tension looping systems, but also kind of the sheer weights and the loading, the cellular organization can work. So those are a couple of suggestions. Do those make any sense? I think you missed for a second. Sorry.
Yeah, I got disconnected and I missed everything from Fry Auto. I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries.
Everything.
Well, okay. So I just suggested a couple of things. One, Otto worked with filamentary structures like threads with many loops, and he tied those up in loops on a rigid framework and then dipped them in water, and that produced things that branch together and kind of make their own consolidated branching rivers, and they're really interesting.
He did the bubbles kind of with the bubble structures.
He did bubble structures as well.
Yes.
That's right. That's another series. I guess two hints about enriching this is to try to do loops on loops on loops. In other words, at the bottom of the first catenaries, put another one on, and then put another one on that, and then put another one on that, and really try to keep it going. You're starting to do that, like in this study here. But I would suggest that you could actually kind of think about this like that and that and that and that and that, and that will take some need for lateral forces as well, because otherwise it'll just all clump together and kind of like consolidate to a point. But I think it could help enrich this. The other thing is just to really enjoy the sense that these are individual cells which are loaded on the filaments. And just like beads or drops of dew or jewels or cells, I have a feeling that could be an extremely interesting way to enrich this as well. I mean, if you had a second generous number of elements that were working with this, it's going to make it really complex and really messy and hard to deal with. But maybe the shorthand of threads would be a satisfying way to go.
Okay.
I think it's spectacularly beautiful.
Thank you.
Roshni.
Philip.
Hi.
So, my inspiration for my concept is the traditional weaving technique of garlands in the south of India. So they have a very specific way of weaving the flowers. So this is a single layer of weaving, and it looks rather 2.5 dimensional. But I think when the flowers bloom and when women wear them in their hair, it has a sort of 3-dimensional aspect to it. And the above image is, they have a very particular way where they wrap the thread around their fingers, and they put 2 of these buds together. So I was inspired by that and wanted to try to mimic the weaving pattern, or the way they knot the flowers with paper clips and paper twine. So the material I have chosen are paper clips, and because it's a paper clip, I opted to use twine that's made out of paper because it has a sense of rigidity to it. So it also responds well to being clipped onto a paper. So the initial prototype was with just a single wrap around the open arm of the paper clip. And because it's a triangular paper clip, they tend to lean in the direction that I wrap them around the open arm. So as you may see in the pictures above, it's sort of leaning towards one direction. Whereas in the second set of prototypes, which is not very distinctly different, but maybe from the last image at the bottom, you can see the difference between the two, where in the left string, I've used just one line of knots, whereas on the right side of the line, I've used 2 twines, one on the left side and one on the right side. So it has a little more stability, in the sense that it doesn't entirely just warp towards one direction. So this is just something I was experimenting with. I haven't achieved the results I desire to achieve, but it was just, I guess it's a work in progress, and I'm trying to identify how to make these knots a little more firm, because I realized the more I tried playing with them and tried looking at it like a DNA, they kept slipping off because I hadn't tied them, but rather just wrapped it around the open arm. So, yeah.
When I look at this, it makes me think that a further option of this might be to have a pair of paper clips where the thread is continuous at the edge, and it's also engaging a second. And then once you have this symmetrical single strand, then you'd be able to do the same thing at the edge of this one to the next, and you'd be able to build up a whole alternating structure of thread to clip to thread to clip to thread to clip in this wonderful kind of chain. I could imagine this would be a really extraordinary kind of fabric that would result from that. Is that interesting to check out?
Absolutely. In fact, I think it was really interesting when I started off, as you may see with the prototype one, where there's just 4 small clips on it. It started to look interesting when I put a couple of clips together. Then the more the number of clips increased, it started to distort and look disordered. So I think adding a symmetry and adding multiple layers might make it look a little more visually appealing rather than unorganized.
It seems like there's quite a common ground with Hanan's maple keys too, and it makes me think, okay, in the case of the maple keys, we were really thinking about 3 different kinds of materiality, like that heart that I was so worried about piercing. It's kind of like an act of violence, and the wing, which is so effective, this beautiful membrane. You can actually pick up one of those wings right from the tip, right? And it might feel kind of abusive, but actually it can flop around, and it's quite happy because it's got a line of boning all the way around the edge, doesn't it? Am I right in that? Is it? Yeah, exactly. And that looks like a point of attachment too, then. I mean, maybe we should think about that as an attachment point, you know, rather than saying, oh, it has to be free. You're frowning, Hanan. Does it seem like it's abusive?
My main problem with this as a point of attachment is that it's very delicate. So like it is very structurally stable on one edge, but it
Yep.
is very delicate on the other. That being said, attaching that to a heart does seem more structurally stable.
Uh-huh.
So you can create these kind of, I don't know, I've been playing.
Cool.
But yeah.
Well, I just, you know, it just seems like there's an astonishing common ground with Roshni's elements, and then it's extremely interesting to see the kind of inversion, Roshni, you know, where Han's wings or your flowers then become this paperclip, which is really tough, and so you can, you know, you can pick it up at its tip, and you could fasten it, and maybe it would be worthwhile trying it both ways. And just seeing how both of those conditions really can be experienced, you know.
Sure.
I really love the idea of multiplying this laterally anyway into many lines so that it could really be a fabric. Beautiful work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Lewis, tell us about yours. Wow,
Yeah. Hi. Well, I
amazing.
would like to start with the reasons why I choose these two materials, because it has a symbolic meaning. My father is an electrician and my mother is a nurse, so I have those two elements in my house: the terminal electrical terminal board and the silicon tubes. So with that electrical terminal board, I start to cutting and trying to connect this its form, its morphology. Let me start to experiment with, say, many kinds of connections, and well, the silicon tubes let me thinking in something that I'm so interested, which is the vascular system. I always trying to make the system, so understanding the systems as its function. So that's let me thinking in why the whole system, the groups of groups can have an origin and also a function as itself, like as an organism as itself, but also as a symbiont that can work with the human and work for itself.
These are incredibly interesting materials. So these are terminal block covers. Is that right? These would have a screw electrode in them normally?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And are they very expensive or are they pretty cheap? Like, are you able to have quite a few of them?
Well, I have lost lots of it in my house because my father works with it, and when it's time, when they don't function anymore, he leaves it in my house, so I have more of them.
Let me suggest maybe, you know, I'm really tantalized by this offering a kind of a basic geodesic kit. And when I say geodesic, I'm referring to a very particular way of assembling skeletal fabrics, where we see struts on one hand, that is the vectors that go between joints and nodes. And I think of the tubing as being like that. And it's lovely for it to be either flexible or rigid, depending on how you handle it, or having like a little curvature, and maybe that curvature produces something very interesting. And then the hub system or the nodes looks like it very naturally works with kind of symmetrical paired things. That is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. And that presents something really fascinating as well, I think. If you were to, there's a downloadable folio on, at least is my website. If you go to www.lasg.ca and look up Archimedean polyhedron, I'm just going to put that into the chat. Where's the chat? Actually, I don't know whether I can do that while I'm sharing the screen. I'll stop sharing and I'll put it in the chat then. Archimedean. So that's a folio at, and what it is, it's a pattern book of how to put together certain repeating simple geodesic hubs with spokes, with struts. And I have a feeling that maybe you could use that to inspire a little bit more of what you're doing. I mean, I really love what you're doing. And I just have a feeling that this is a very, very provocative, really valuable series where you could take something like the Archimedean polyhedron series, which has a whole set of patterns where you could make large waffles, for example, and spherical constructions. And you could just take the symmetrical ones, like the ones involving, say, 4s and 8s, and then you could make a whole series of figures out of them. So I have a feeling that there's incredible potency in working with these materials. It's marvelous that you have them available.
Hmm.
Lisa, do you have any comments? Sorry, go ahead, Lisa.
No, yes, I will view them, the Archimedean polyhedra. And yes, I'm trying to experiment. This is my moment to experiment. So I think that I could make some more proportions.
Beautiful.
Thanks.
Cool.
I really
Wonderful.
like the way that it kind of like marries both of your parents' different disciplines. And also, I feel like this particular exploration, it's interesting the relationship between the two different materials. It's like which one is the connector and which one is the like unit that you're trying to connect together. Like there's a bit, like there's different ways that you can present it. Like if the tubing is longer and like woven together, or yeah, like the tubing could be the visual aspect, and then the electrical component could be the connector. Or if like you cut the tubing much shorter and then like do a lot more within 3D with the electric connector, could be thought of in both ways, which I think is super interesting in that way.
You know, just building on that comment, Lisa, you know, it's from what you said, Louis, it sounds like you have quite a special affinity with these materials, and it's very tempting to see you as possibly making a kind of an external anatomy in our own bodies. I hope it's okay if I see it that way. I mean, for example, when I look at an image like this, it's hard not to think that some of these elements are like small bones, but that are working as an exoskeleton in a rather kind of harsh, puncturing, intense way as an extension of my own hand. And likewise, that the tubing structure is an extension of my venous and arterial network. And in other words, an external circulation system, which is vulnerable, but really involved in the world. And so if I'm on a reasonable track in that, in thinking that this is a kind of an expanded, rather intimate anatomy based on association with your family, then this could start to be quite an extraordinary kind of like emotionally charged fabric. Are those kind of associations okay, or are those kind of like different directions to where you want to go?
No, it's exactly what I was thinking of. Yes, I think on the extension of a human being, and also as itself, as an living organism, or as its function itself, how this system, this machine, can be as itself an object or something that works, and an extension of me.
I've just written down a couple of associations with particular parts of the human anatomy, or more generally from biology. The extracellular matrix, the ECM, is the region that lies outside individual cell bodies, and it could really be thought of as a fundamental kind of proto-organ that runs through the entirety of our bodies, a whole field where, instead of just thinking of each cell and each organ as being a thing with the empty space between them, or else just being stuck together with there's nothing between them. In the talk yesterday, I was really trying to emphasize that sense that space does not need to be thought of as empty. The spaces in between are kind of alleyways in which a whole host of things happen, incredibly important things, and those alleyways are fundamentally different in character, and that asks for, I think, some associations about architecture, where we realize that the back alleys and the laneways and the rivulets and the places which are not public, but where you can be and gather, or let's say they're alternate public paths, rather than just the prescribed ones, constitute an extraordinarily important way of thinking about how experience can be figured and worked and contributed to. At least the ECM, the extracellular matrix, is an incredibly important place for biology, and it connects our entire being. Like, for example, the lymph system works throughout the ECM. All kinds of signaling. Our emotional well-being is controlled very, very much through the neurotransmitters, which are not simply through the venous system of the orthodox artery and vein, and like the regular public highways of our circulation system. The ECM is another kind of interconnected field in which all kinds of things happen. And likewise, the fascia, that is the collagen network, which lies underneath our skin, our epidermis, and which runs through the entirety of our body, also has a kind of a lovely filamentary called collagen soft structure, which likewise is an entire comprehensive organ through which things flow and connect. And the materialities of both of those are extremely interesting, because they're quite different than the kind of either tension or compression, either figure or ground, kind of clarity of our traditional models. They're much more of an intermediate kind of viscous, colloidal, semi-fluid, thickening quality, and that might give rise to the idea that the exterior anatomies that you're producing in this way have some qualities that complement what we already are, and maybe that weave us together or expand our identities. I just think that it's a really lovely kind of meditation that you're starting. I really want to encourage you to continue it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Here, I'll just go back to this. Marisabel.
Okay, so I started out with my points of inspiration being, I was inspired by your sort of challenge to develop the fabric of maximum precarity and maximum reactivity. And so I wanted to work with something that had a life cycle and had a change or transformability in itself. And I've often, this is, for me, I've often really, I'm drawn to, this sounds really weird, but I'm really drawn to things that start to take on a different shape as they dry out and die. And so I found that, you know, I wanted to work with something in nature. And so I have a lot of maples around me, and it's not because you're in Canada, but I do have sugar maples that I began to work with first the sugar maple, which is the leaf, because originally, and then that was one point of inspiration. And the other inspiration is the seed pod to your right, which was the elastomeria, which, as you can see at the very top, is, you know, sort of now past its flowering stage. And now the seed pods are actually much more visible and structured. They really structure the flower at this point. And initially I had thought, well, you know, what my idea was to kind of combine two seed pods and kind of create a node that then I would begin to connect in some way across a kind of a three-dimensional matrix. But I realized I was going to deplete the seedbed. So I stepped away from that idea and I decided to start to work with the maple. And initially the maple, I thought, well, it's a tessellation project, so I'm going to work with the shape of the leaf, and I'm going to, you know, it's basically a geometry for a more two-dimensional layout of this maple. And what I discovered was that that wasn't working. It couldn't work because of the stem, and the stem became really very much a part of the cell. So there are two different studies that I did with the maple leaf. One on the left, it's kind of a daisy chain. And what I was doing was I wired, essentially, I wired the stems of the leaves so that they start to create a spine along the back. And with the idea that this would be kind of a more complex thread. And what I started to discover, though, which is very interesting to me, is that because the stems, obviously, you know, the model, my diagram, always reduces everything, but because every stem has a slightly different cant, as you start to wire these stems, they start to create a curvature, a natural curvature, so that there is no chance of this, you know, ever being a straight line. It starts to take on its own sort of path. My thought here was that these could then be woven together in some way. What I was always interested in too is the fact that even as you know, in the last day or so, so in the actual model that I made, there are not all the same size leaves, and some are actually starting to curl up and others are still remaining flat. And so the actual texture of this is something that I'm interested in seeing develop, and how it could start to kind of create openings where I think there are none right now. So that was one first sort of idea. And then that diagram that you see there is basically showing that curvature. It's basically showing one size and one type of stem. And so it's going to have a pronounced curvature, but it would be much more subtle if you had variations in terms of the stem. Then on the right side, what I did was I started to develop, okay, so what is the cell here? What am I defining as cell? And what is the cell, you know, the cell here? I started to compose, probably in advance of what the actual assignment was, to do a composite cell, which is wiring the actual stems together to form a quadrant. And then those quadrants at different scales are kind of assembled together with the idea that there would be some kind of matrix that runs through there, which I haven't done in the actual model yet. So those are the two sort of thoughts there that I had, that I wanted to, with this, you know, the density, I could see very much how just scaling and the introduction of a different wire or thickness of wire as a kind of matrix or ordering system could begin to weave those elements together. Then I also went and did an attempt with the elastomeria by isolating just the seed pod to the right. I don't have a diagram for that yet, but the idea was that it is kind of a density that's kind of emerging from what is here steel wool, which I unfolded, and the steel wool has its own sort of densities already patterned in the actual wool and can be pulled apart. And so, and, you know, made to kind of structure. And then those pods were rubber cemented to the steel wool. The pods are really heavy in comparison to the steel wool. So it doesn't, you know, I think it needs an additional element of structure. But something in these pods that I really like is the three-dimensionality, but also the idea of there's these ideas of these filaments, but then also these densities, which are the seed pods themselves, that could be interpreted in a different material, potentially as like a woolen bud, but that, you know, seems to be a potential sort of way of kind of a coming to fruition of the mesh. Anyway, those are sort of the studies I did so far.
Wow. Lisa, would you like to?
Sorry. I think what would be really helpful for me, next step might be to take the pod and actually do a diagram of the pod, or, you know, also model it and then start to see how it could become, you know, in 3D space, a denser matrix. But I didn't have time, obviously, for that yet.
Lisa, do you have observations?
I really like the material selection and exploration. Like I agree the 3D-ness of the seed pod is really interesting, and the wire connection technique that you're using is also really interesting. I think that the relationship between the units that you selected is something that you could like push further, because the seed pods on the steel wool, for example, I feel like if you like more deliberately divided up the seed pods so that they were so that they had like it was a deliberate selection of how many pods per bundle is, and then the bundles had then a more geometric relationship with each other, because at the moment they're reading very much as like floral bundles on the steel wool, like nature has decided for you how many many is in per bundle, and their relationship is not as clear. So I think that would be an interesting thing to push for. And I know you already spoke about how you wanted to push the idea of the matrix more, but that would be my comment.
You know, just building on that, I wonder whether there might be a latent kind of granular stratification in the steel wool. I mean, steel wool is a really incredible material. It's fabulous, wonderful material, and we can see that there's a slight sinuous path emerging here, where you know where there's vertical tendrils, and I have a feeling that could be encouraged. I mean, the fibers really like continuing that way, and then it's fairly easy in our hands to create divisions, and so maybe that would be a very helpful system to encourage, so that if we had this more oriented striated fabric with thickenings emerge out of that lovely distributed felt, then maybe that would just give enough strength to start to set up some seams, which then could be the attachment points for some periodic clusters of the other material working in 3 dimensions. I have a feeling that would be incredibly satisfying. And, you know, it's also tantalizing to imagine how that might work in 3 dimensions. That is to say, whether if you were able to hang a rather large swath of this expanded steel wool with that striation, then maybe working on both sides of it in order to build that up. And you know, I mean, it'd be awfully tempting to see, okay, so if we achieve one layer like that, then could we have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 layers and start to become, you know, to move into a truly three-dimensional lattice. That's one thought about kind of some latent order that's already present there. Another is about this rather tantalizing tessellation, because it's a very interesting kind of like beautifully awkward resolution between a pentagonal polyhedron and then a quadrilateral tessellation. And isn't it amazing to see that someone lurking in there also is a hexagonal structure, but by virtue of the way these are the way the main point is neutralized by being absorbed into the diagonal, the quadrilateral. And so if that's been neutralized, then what do we have left? Well, we have a set of 6-way points. And so that becomes a hexagonal structure, which is like fabulous. Oh my goodness me, what we could do with that if those were explicit. And that's a really tantalizing thing in the sense that perhaps these points, those 6 little points in each one of these, are the most delicate and the most untouchable of all. Just in the same way, like where we were talking about Hanen's maple keys and the outer tips of their wings or being, or one of his flowers. I mean, like just the sense that it might be cruel to kind of like grasp those outer tips and try to manipulate them, but whether or not we structure them by providing space for them to be, or actually grasp them and tie them down, and insist on them being attached. Either way, I have a feeling that that's kind of like a profoundly important part of the fabric that emerges. So I'm just super interested to see where this could go as a continuing tessellation. And I have a feeling like that these 2 studies, that is to say, this more explicit tessellation, where we have this curious, interesting interchange between a pentagon and a hexagonal and a quadrilateral unit, and then this kind of much more deeply materially based thing in which you have these lovely balloon little vesseling seed pods and this filamentary path. I mean, that's extraordinarily rich. So I have a feeling that like listening to both of those sides make complete sense. The rivulets that are made by aligning all of the twigs have a lovely commonality to my mind with the steel wool as well.
Yeah.
This is extraordinarily rich.
It's odd, yes. Yeah, it turned out that way. I mean, I just unraveled the steel wool and it was like, my God, where did these curves come from?
Fabulous. Right. Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you. Okay. We have our final one. Go ahead.
Oh, hi. I went to a convenience store today and found this really colorful wire and this one. And I feel it's very joyful and also very cheap. So I decided to use this material. And then I think that, okay, maybe I can do something that's very bouncy out of it. And so I start to twist it and give it this kind of volume. And then I try to twist them together, and then it will become like this. Mm-hmm. And also I try some other ways as well to make it more like spring shape, but it's also kind of bouncy and elastic. So I feel that maybe if it's a fabric, when people wear it and when people move, then it starts to have this shape movement, and it will be very interesting. And if we maybe take it further, maybe it can be interactive, that if people touch it, or people come close by, then it will just give this vibration and then it will bounce by itself. Just try to make this very joyful, just like this material. And also there is another option, but that one is actually my first thought out of this, but I didn't really find the material. So I didn't really do the physical thing. just want to share it for fun. I feel that because you talk about how people respond to the environment and something like that. So I feel maybe it's very interesting if our skin is kind of sticky. So I can kind of attract things towards me. So I think, oh, that's like an octopus. So what if we have those kind of hook, sucker hook on our skin? Then I can stick onto like people or stick onto walls, something like that. Yeah, we will kind of like Spider-Man. Yeah, that's it.
Lisa, what are your comments?
Hi. Yeah, again, I think the material choice is really interesting. I love the sucker idea also, and the way that you've started to imagine how it could work on the body and in an environment. I think the potentially the color choice could be more deliberate. Like if there's all these colors that you're using anyway, that it could be used to describe an underlying pattern that you're trying to achieve. Just a little bit more like concept behind the colors that you've selected and how they work together. And also the what if we scroll just a little bit further, what was begun on the on the screen, that next to octopus tentacle, it says something old, a fold. The kind of knitting effect that you're starting to achieve in that would be something. There's something interesting there. I'm looking forward to seeing how it develops.
You know, it seems to me, just building on that actually the suckers and these little twisted elements actually are very similar and so it's still very much one project. I think that rather than making a closed boundary figure, that this is radically open, and it's kind of no accident that these things cluster together and clump together because they're just so sticky, both by virtue of the little filaments on the wire, and then also the form that you've made into the spiral, which so very happily kind of aligns and meshes. What I would say is that it might be very helpful for you to make a couple of hundred of these. I mean, like if you were to really compound this and really push it in density, then I think that it might be interesting to see how these things quite naturally come together, because they're probably going to want to align themselves. There's going to be a certain number of them which are going to rather happily create some longer filaments. And then with that orientation, there will also be an awful lot of cross-linking. So it's going to stick together. And I have a feeling that it'll be kind of like a very curiously kind of striated, oriented fabric with a certain bias, but at the same time with a lot of cross-linking. Which is maybe a bit different than the kind of radically open or less oriented system that's implied in the figure right now. On the other hand, I mean that like there are clumps here that are oriented as well. So I don't want to say that it wouldn't be like this. I'm just very interested to see what it would be by really pushing this. And I have a feeling that this would in turn have the effect of being like this, of being something that's just like an unapologetic collector of vulnerability. I mean, now the question about what the balance would be on the body, about whether this feels like you're opening your body or actually kind of like pushing outwards in a kind of an exfoliation, where the flowering is so kind of much of a projection that it also produces a kind of a of a counterform inside where you're also sheltered by virtue of that outward push, that outward flowering. And that might be a really, really interesting question, you know, a rather sensitive one to consider about what kind of balance or what kind of flow in and out this does. My own observations started with the sense that it was an act of vulnerability, of pulling in and sticking together and gathering all of the world to me. But on the other hand, if there was a kind of a disposition of it growing, then I have a feeling that it does create kind of a sanctuary inside it by virtue of the flow being outward. Do you know what I mean about that? Do you have any comments on that? It's a curious question anyway about, you know, whether is the sucker sucking at me, or is it collecting from the outside world? You know, like just is there a kind of an ambivalence to how this fabric is working in it collecting and pushing and collecting and pushing?
I just I think that I want to have this connection with the environment. So yeah, so I feel that even though it's two ideas, they are kind of similar because they all come from the same thoughts. Yeah.
Beautiful. Okay. Well, colleagues, I'm going to suggest just one general piece of advice for all of you, which is to try to radically increase the number and density. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean spend vast more amounts of time. You know, there can be economy in your decisions, but I love the things that are happening here. I think that they will benefit from having another degree of tessellation in them so that we can see what the groups of the groups are. And then what we can see what the groups of the groups are. In other words, there's something of a threshold, I believe, when a cellular accretion or a bundle or a tectonic assembly or a clustering turns into a fabric. And that's a very subjective line. You know, when does a cluster or a tribe or a family turn into the field, into the ocean itself? My hope is that you'll be able to acquire enough density so that you can see that happening to some degree, that there really is an experience of a kind of an oceanic immersion, at least that is invoked, that is evoked by what you do. And that's, you know, it can risk something which turns into gigantism or indiscriminate continuing. It can, if it doesn't refresh itself with some new instabilities and some new growth, then it can risk feeling like something rather negative, you know, like an indiscriminate just giant. And we actually have some disease words for that, like cancers even. So we can be aware that what I'm inciting you to do personally, with my own words, is to radically increase is a dangerous thing to do. We can debate that, but I do think that there could be something really delicious in the immersion of saying absolutely yes to the ideas that you're generating, and really try to ask them to be fulfilled in a kind of an efflorescent fertility, where you say, this is a way of populating the world. Let it flow, fertilize it, let it increase. And maybe next time we'll have a discussion of the word eutrophy, which is a problematic word. I'll just put that in the chat. Eutrophy. Tropic turning is a lovely kind of dynamic. I introduced the word quasi-geostrophic, in undulating, stuttering turning yesterday. Eutrophy, EU, is a word from the Greek and Roman, which is about a glory and a beauty and a harmony. And yet eutrophy, if you look up a dictionary definition, means the condition of becoming anoxic, like in a swamp where growth also stops because it's all clotted together. So anoxic, by the way, means where growth has happened so much that it's consumed all of the oxygen in the room, and therefore it stops growing, and even it risks very negative things happening, as you can imagine might happen when a swamp is overgrown and growth stops. This is a rather contentious question, though, about whether a glory of a kind of an exfoliation produces something deeply fulfilling, or whether actually we want to trim and cut and stop being liberal. And you can see that there's a political discussion happening in there as well, as certainly between liberal and conservative forces, or perhaps in a Christian tradition, we could say Protestants and Catholics in the European history, and how the energy of exfoliating and saying yes to interconnection, and then saying no and reducing. The Buddhist tradition of the Mahayana, the great tradition, versus the Hinayana, the narrow tradition, is perhaps an example in another tradition of thinking the same way. And we see this again and again. We certainly see it in contemplative traditions in Islam. So I'm simply quoting some, rather self-indulgently from different world religions in speaking about this energy of exfoliating and then constricting are both really, really significant energies. And if we find design traditions where they can start to fluctuate and complement each other, then perhaps this leads to a sense of homeostasis. That is a kind of a condition of great vitality. I'll just put that in the chat. In which there is simply not a fundamental kind of toxic conflict or a risk or a sense that one thing is fighting the other in a very negative sense. Rather, we get an extraordinary sense of complementary flow and very, very fertile growth. So perhaps I'll just let that be a meditation for some of the implications of where these fabrics might go. Now, it's now close to 12, at least here in Toronto, and we have about half an hour left in our session today. Like yesterday, I've been self-indulgent and I haven't asked if it's okay to take a break. Is it okay if we keep going, or do people need just a couple of minutes to break? Okay, I think I saw gentle nods, and so if it's okay with you, we will continue. And I apologize for not even thinking about that. It's just really lovely to see your work and to speak this way. So Lisa, would it work now to shift for you to take the floor?
Sure, that sounds great.
Can I ask one brief question first?
Of course.
As we move forward with developing these, do you recommend the fabrics? Do you recommend that we do that at the level of sort of a digital? I mean, the patterning, is it something you think is unnecessary to do that in the computer, or should we continue to try to do it in an analog format with actual materials?
Oh, I think that's a really important question. And I always say both, Maricel. And I would just encourage you to be judicious and sensitive so that you stretch enough to really, do something that might feel prodigious and immersive, but without that turning into something that is indiscriminate or perhaps causes unhealthy expense or strain. Now, the different, I'm sure, however, that both are important. I think that the mechanical arraying capabilities of a digital model, for example, or a manual drawing, extremely helpful. Also working in model form as well as full size form. That's a really intriguing question. And I'm going to ask you to work at strategic scales, which are both model and full size. And what is full size? Well, we don't know what these things are. What is the fulfilled full-size scale of the fabrics that you've made. Is this actually larger than full size and it really wants to be more like a molecular flesh? Is it an analog for, for an architecture in which this is actually a columniation and spandrel system? Is it a fabric for an individual? Try that on, please. Be playful.
Okay.
Be playful with scale, and maybe make some jokes about it too. Be prepared for some ironies as well as some tragedies. I would encourage you to seriousness, try on both of those spectrum, both comedy and tragedy. This is serious business, and it benefits from some disorientation, which can certainly be done by doing something that might be particularly. It might seem ridiculous, but then it might have a profound insight in it. So that is to say that the physicality of letting it speak to us means that some amount of physical model making is very important. But then I would definitely use your tools. Use your tools to project. Make a world out of it, and of course that means projection in virtual space as well. Inevitably.
Yeah.
Does that make sense, Lisa? Would you comment on that as well?
I was muted. Yeah, I think that at the end, the fabric material, the physical material is what we're aiming to make. And the digital space is a really helpful tool to work to get a lot of different options and just think through really fast. It's an option for fast sketching so that you can work towards your fabric development. So I would say that the digital sketching is a tool, and the fabric experiment is more like there's more that you can learn as well in the physical space. There's so many arrays that you can make up in the digital space, but then the problem solving that you get to in the physical space is really, the thing.
All right, so Lisa, the floor is yours.
I'm going to share screen now. Let me know if you can see my my PowerPoint.
Yes.
Great. So this is a presentation just to show some of the working methods, sketching and draping that we use at Philips Studio for some of the past projects that we've worked on. So this was a project called Emancipation. It was last year's Emancipation month, and it was done in collaboration with an amazing artist called Michael Leapoy and the filmmakers Hailey Elaine and Eric Black. So the task that we were trying to do here was to make a costume for a Moko Jambi character in the short film that we were making. And she was going to be like a winged angel. And we were making a few other characters' costumes as well for this film, including a child that the Moko Jambi guardian figure was introducing into the world. So there was Philip's world in the film, which was kind of the Moko Jambi world. And then there was also the real world, and the film was about the intersection between those two worlds. So this is just one drape on the stand that we were trying out for that project. It uses a component called the feathered ghost component, and it builds on, so I guess this is an example of what we were talking about for one of the tasks that we're trying to achieve in this workshop for tomorrow and Thursday, which was the combination of materials, because the feathered ghost is based on a geometric hex scaffold. And then the secondary layer that's added on top of that is the mylar fronds, like the white dissipative frond, like feathered halo that surrounds her. So that's just one example of how we were trying to achieve with Philips' existing component library, this idea of winged Moko Jambi. And then continuing through the pattern language, Philips pattern language, this one was an experiment with the spheres. So like starting to cluster together spheres and spars. This one we really tried to, and we would have wanted to go further, I think, if we continued down this path, to build away from the body. So it's not just, it's something between architecture and fashion. Like we wanted to really pull away from the idea that that this garment needs to clothe the body and build it into a shell and cowls and immersive space that surrounded the figure. And then continuing into the winged feather idea. This one is a little bit more literal, I guess. We started deconstructing the feathered ghosts components, just taking the fronds and putting them into like a winged array, draped into a dress, and then started developing it further to combine it with the more 3D cowl from before and into a winged structure. So in the end, Michael Lipoi, the collaborating artist, is he teaches a Moko Jambi workshop every year. He was the one that we really worked together on to create the 3D aspect of the wings, like how to get the structure of the wings so that the Moko Jambi dancer could really walk around on, she was on stilts as well. So this ended up being quite a huge costume. And she, with her huge wings, and this cowl ended up in the final design also. And yeah, the final structural problem solving was done very much in collaboration with the Moko Jambi artist, Michael Lipoi, as he's done that kind of scale of costume before. And then a few more experiments here. This shows two examples of the tessellating hex geometry, which is one of the very core design concepts in Philip's work. So the one on the left here, the black spars that are on the body, that shows it follows on from the spars that I was talking about yesterday. This is the file before it's pulled, and it's cut on mylar that's backed with flocked fabric that's like heat bonded together with the mylar. The mylar is kind of a really essential part of all of this fabric development, because it helps so much with it helps with what we were talking about yesterday in terms of pushing the limit of the material. Like if you back it with the mylar, you can really push to minimum strap thicknesses of like 1.2 millimeters without the fabric itself fraying away, because the weave of the fabric or the materiality of the flocking means that it can't really hold up to 1.2 millimeter strap thicknesses. But with the mylar together, that's how we start achieving like super delicate fabric manipulations like that. And then on the right hand side, this was actually another idea for wings. So this is like part of a small sculpture that ended up being installed in San Jose Airport. And it's the idea of using another component from Philip's design library called the Sagasso component, which is also at its base a hex unit, but it has a chiral quality. So you can see like the design language of the feathered mylar still, and the hex language, but everything has been twisted, and then the frond that it carries with it twists also, and it's known as a Sagasso spiral unit. These are some of like the smallest Sagassos that we've made. You can also see in some of Philip's sculptures much larger Sagasso units that feel like an entire sculpture, but we wanted to work in this small scale so that it feels closer to the body, and this was one of the concepts that we had for the wings also, with the spiral Sagasso. And then this image comes back to the spars, and instead of using the sphere geometry, we started looking again into that idea of extensions and cowls moving from the body. And this image on the left kind of shows a different relationship between the architectural scale and the fashion design scale. So we wanted to show the concept that the two beings are kind of growing together, like I guess like stalagmites and stalactites in some way. Yeah, just the relationship. I would say in direct relationship to Philip's sculptures, it feels a little bit like his the shower assemblies that I made, which are very much more linear ways of stacking spars. But it just shows, like, if we compare the image on this screen here with the sphere, with the sphere development, it's two like complementary ways to create a 3D form from the same hexagonal component. So this is just some of the developments that we made for that project. And this one, again, if you look closely, it's another Sargasso unit, but with black mylar fronds. And the fronds, again, if you look closely, the frond relationship is quite different here than the white fronds that we were looking at before, because they're very, they're aligned perpendicularly almost to the arms, whereas before in the Sargasso on the right hand side for this experiment, they're just the fronds just lay on top of the spirals and like really follow the curve of the spirals. So it's two different possibilities to combine the dressing layer and the scaffold layer on the spiral Sargasso sculpture. And then I'm going to talk also about another project. This was some work in progress sketches that we made for the film that went to the Venice Biennale in Architecture 2021. So there was a film, we were doing it in collaboration with Warren Dupreez and Nick Thornton-Jones. They're fashion photographers and filmmakers, and Salvador Breed worked on the sound composition for this film, which was really about, it was all digital. Like a lot of work was put into modeling all of the sculptures in the digital space. All of the components, like every single detail was like modeled and rendered with like its materiality. So like all of the glass and its filling and its color and the way that it lends light, all of that detail was modeled in a 3D space to create this film. And these concept sketches we were trying to work on, especially the relationship between Philip's sculptures and this kind of alien being that was being born from the sculpture, or the sculpture being born from the being. Again, it was like the back and forth relationship, like which one is the parent and which one is the child, is a pretty continual question in Philip's work. So that was what we were trying to explore in this series of sketches. So yeah, just some thought processes of how the sculpture might grow from a body in these transitional sketches. So it's like you can see here, a river starting to grow out from the arms of the person, and then that transitioned into a sphere growing out from like the cradle of the person's hands. And so you can see the project that all of those concepts are pulled from, and also the film itself was referenced from this project, which is Gaslight Meander from 2019, which was installed at Tapestry Hall in Cambridge, Ontario. So you can see like the sphere structure that we were inspired by, as well as the river structure that we were inspired by. And again, so like the relationship between the human and the sculpture is one relationship that we were really interested in exploring in the film. And Gaslight Meander has a really lovely like story of evolution in it also, because you can, so the sphere is considered the most evolved part of the sculpture because it's so dense and like the geometry is very carefully worked out. And then it starts to unroll into the area that's called the river, where you still, like when we were talking about groups of groups, I think the river is a very good example of that, because you still have the spars grouped together in like groups of 6 or 7. And they were referred to as posts, which were the groups pointing down, and finials, which were the groups pointing up, and which the river was hung from. And then those posts and finial clusters were then clustered together even further into different areas of like evolution in the river as well. And then when you move out further from the river, you get to the cloud sargasso, which I was talking about earlier, which is the spiral sargasso units, which is it's like kind of the soup, the original soup. So it's the most simplified form of the sculpture. And in some ways, it's also arguably the oldest part of the sculpture. So it's like, from an evolutionary point of view, you start with the simplest form and like the cloud, and then it evolves into the river, and it evolves into the sphere. So from an evolutionary standpoint, the sphere, even though it's the most evolved, and in some ways it could be considered the parent of the sculpture, in other ways it's the youngest part of the sculpture in evolutionary terms. So again, it's like the story reads both ways, depending on if you're looking at it from an evolutionary standpoint, or if you're looking at it from like a parent and child relationship, and like which one is more grown and developed. You can read the sculpture in both ways. So then this was a little bit more detailing on the concept that we're trying to build for the film, with the relationship with the human in the sculpture. And then we moved into a few different concepts. This one was sargasso to human concept, and like the idea that the human is like, we wanted to like start out with just arms that are made out of sargasso, and then the arms start stitching together the rest of the body from the sargasso soup, was the concept behind this idea. And then I think this one ended up being the storyboard that we were really refining for the final film. So it was sargasso as the starting point, so sculpture to start, and then from that it started to grow out into like a vortex, or kind of like you can kind of read a sphere out of this, and a human slowly starts to emerge from the center of the vortex. And we really wanted to represent the human figure as being made from the same material as Philip's sculptures. So you can see it start to emerge slowly, still built out of sargasso, and then she disappears again. So yeah, the final film actually just got released online earlier this month. So it's available to watch on Philip's Instagram, and also on the LASG YouTube if you wanna have a look at the final film as well. Yeah, that's it for me. Stop share.
Lisa, I wonder whether it would work just to play the short film, just
Yeah,
as
for
a
sure.
way, so that, would you mind doing that on
Yeah,
your
I can pull that
screen
up.
and share the sound? It's just 5 minutes, and that way we can kind of anchor the sketching that you've shared.
Front room for sound purposes. Oh wait, Anne's in the front room. I'm just pulling it up now. Okay, I'm gonna share screen again.
I've been editing all my videos for years and going into the studio and sitting there for days and days and days. I think should
There's
like
some stray sound.
right like here.
I wonder where that
Yeah,
is.
like right there, and then I should
Lisa.
cut shots of it.
It's just
The ad.
Oh, it's just the ad, sorry.
My head. My body the color of snow. They rain from the skies. They rise from the earth. They pour from the rocks. They find myself everywhere. Be in everything.
Philip, I think you're muted if you're trying to talk.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I was just giving a very, very sensitive reflection. I was talking to myself. That's really embarrassing. I wonder what your experience was of hearing that and listening to that film through Zoom. I found it to be incredibly compressed and very, very jangly, and some of the sound was really intensely awful. Now, not necessarily atrocious, but just much more violent than was intended in the composition. There's in a high definition full spectrum film like this, there's deep bass subliminal tones and gentle textures, and almost all of that was lost. Instead we just got these figural kind of like really jangly stuff happening. And also curiously, because of the slight jumpiness and lags in the playing, the figural material also came across much more strongly. And so I was kind of amazed by the almost cartoon-like presence of the human figure in this. What we were, the edge that we were, so I'll say, okay, ooh, this is really important information, to see it expressed this way. We were really working in the same way that Lisa's drawings showed just the glimmer of a human figure emerging and then subsiding into a matrix again, like the series that was the most mature series of drawings that she showed, where she just flickered into view and then was subsumed again. You recall that series, right? Tilly Dupree's the wonderful young actor who had a full animatronic scan, high density, and then was scanned through movement as well, and then was completely re-rigged, and then a digital model was constructed, including her eyelashes and lips, and really preparing for a kind of intimacy. And then we backed off of that experience into blurring some qualities and letting her dissolve and moving her closer to a mineral existence, so that it wasn't just a counterpoint of actor in set. Now that, and I'm not sure that very much of that was conveyed. Instead, I felt like, okay, it was quickly kind of like a horror film corpse shot that we got early on, and then also kind of like almost a doll-like figure that was rotating, where the tiny little tremulous sense that, oh, she's alive, she's breathing, she's connecting. Those things get compressed away. I'm not saying they're completely gone, but I think that it would be easier to misunderstand some of the intentions of the film because of the stripping away of those things. Very curious. Anyway, do you know what I mean about those comments? Does that make any sense? This sense of it being a bit cartoony, or getting closer to being cartoony. I'm not quite sure what to do about that because I mean, like they're extraordinary comic book traditions, you know, where reductive coarse grain things are incredibly beautiful and evocative. I mean, there's no particular reason to say no, you must have high density all the time. That would be absurd. You know, it's human perception, which is what we're working with here, and you can evoke sensitivity at you know, a very broad range of scales. But anyway, I'm just struck by that. Because usually I've been kind of on the performer's end of this, where I'm playing it. I haven't been receiving it. Well, I hope that's interesting anyway. And do you have any questions about Lisa's presentation and this new generation of work?
I had a good question. What software did they use to render the video for that movie?
Thanks for asking that. So the first, we do quite intensive modeling in Rhino and sometimes in Fusion, three-dimensional modeling, and then we build that up. And then we make things. And in this film, the imagery came from a combination of digital space, but also we had a whole trunk full of sculptural elements which we sent to our colleagues in London on the condition that they burn and destroy most of it, which they did. And they 3D scanned the elements. And so that's like really a literal photograph of physical things. And then we went about rigging a lot more material. We took it into Houdini. And then in Houdini we did chaining and transpositions and shifting things through multiple rigged recordings, and then through the combination then of Houdini and layers and layers and layers of core 3D models, together with the photogrammetry scan things, plus the information from a comprehensive LiDAR scan of meander, because we did a very, very dense laser scanning of the physical environment of scale, and then that was mapped too. So those are separate layers. Then all of that was put into Unreal, and we put it into the game engine, and then it was reshot using a live camera headset mode, so that the environment that was there was being explored by a very, very human point of view. And so the movements and explorations were in the end, we really tried to earn our way through embodying them so that there would be a sensitivity and a touch rather than programming the movement, you know. So that I'm rather happy about that part, that is the sense that the shooting was closer to it being handheld. In fact, a lot of it was literally handheld in the end, and then it was re-edited, and there was more post-production on it. Do those layers make sense though?
They do, yes. Because it's really interesting to kind of see like the digital aspect, but also feels like you took a lot of the physical elements to it with the amount of detail that was there. So it was really interesting to see the thought process behind the video as well.
Maybe I'll just make one more comment in wrapping up for our sessions today. I had some material on screen that I was going to share, but we'll do that on Thursday, which is precarity, and some of you are already well along on exploring exactly that, and I want to encourage you, please, to make that an overarching theme. Precarity, reactivity, sensitivity. What are qualities in your studies, in the fabric studies that you're now making as part of this workshop, that on one hand give enough coherence for things to really continue? You know, they're there, they're established. There's enough rhythm, enough periodicity to be tough and durable and full of fertility. just the kind of intensity of immersion that comes from establishing a groove and a depth. And then out of that, can you introduce the glimmer and the kind of stutter and the living, breathing quality, which means that this is not anymore inert or simply predictable, but so that it can be utterly poised. I'd love you to give quite a bit of thought to what the sources of that quality of poise and intimacy and intensity can be. The kind of mechanical precarity that I've tried to demonstrate, and that Lisa has showed you also in the shaping of some things so that something is thin and just at the tipping point, you know, so it can move this way or that way, shimmering, is one version of this. The quasi-periodic kind of repetition where something does have a reliable rhythm and then it hiccups, it shifts, and then you acclimatize yourself again, and you climatize yourself again, you know, because we have pathfinding perceptual neurology that's deeply, deeply ingrained in the way we see. It's hard coded. You know, you could say that a deep part of our consciousness is mechanically encoded pathfinding, which means locking on to those rhythms is something that happens as pretty much of a chemical or almost structural level, and yet also deeply ingrained, you know, in our proto brains, is the hunger for seeing the semiquaver or the inconstancy or the disease or the vulnerability, you know, whether or not that's a neurotic or empathetic or hunter or generous or perhaps hostile and selfish impulse, is something that's a very, very difficult thing to reconcile in all of this. And you know, perhaps the truths of those qualities being intermixed, at least in, you know, present in different ways in us. But if we say that those are two fundamental qualities, both the alertness and the sensitivity to the variation itself, the inconstancy, the vulnerability, we're primed to see it. You know, you stand up straight before me, and then, you know, just we are primed with the slightest flicker of the eye or the glistening or the tremor or the shift in the posture of our partner. It's deeply stimulating and deeply arousing and deeply upsetting, those shifts. And that's because we're so sensitive, as if we are instruments for that kind of inconstancy. And yet at the same time, the sense of home, the need for fundamental emplacement of things being stable, of things being in a state of flow, the kind of fundamental periodicity of our world, the fabric, the integrity of our world is so profound. And today, surely we need to see things continue. Surely we need to see rhythms and harmonies establish themselves in the most utterly fulfilled, continuous ways. Now, are those things in conflict, or do they complement each other, those qualities? And what kind of balance might constitute a word like homeostasis, that is the kind of dynamic equilibrium that spells life, as opposed to mere, you know, mechanical kind of organization, is a very, very difficult business to resolve. I feel so pushed and pulled, truly, between wanting walls or wanting to break down those walls, for example, wanting to revelation and refreshment, or wanting integrity and continuity and reliability, to be inside my own tribe, let's say, or my own family or my own community. Who are we and what do we need, and how can we contribute? Well, let me ask you then, just to really pursue this question of precarity in the fabrics that you make. I'm going to try to make an argument to you in the talk that I hope we'll be able to do on Thursday, that it's a deeply responsible quality to pursue, while acknowledging that it can be very disruptive as well, and it might even be a source of suffering as well as joy.
Do you think our tools help or hinder in that dynamic, in that relationship? I'm just thinking about your reaction to watching the video, and it's almost like the fuzziness is lost by the precision afforded to you by the tools.
Yeah.
And same way we, like my question about, do we do this on the digital level or do we do this with materials? Because I know with materials, the variation will be possible to show, and it's that variation is that creates the shimmer. I'm just curious, the level at which we have to interrogate our tools.
I think we really do need to interrogate our tools, Maricel. I think you're asking a really important question. It would, my first kind of like almost automatic reaction is that our tools hinder us in the sense that they're really tilted towards the Platonic tradition. When I say Platonic tradition, I mean the tradition announced by or articulated by Plato starting 2,500 years ago now or 2,400 years ago, in the sense that something pure and reductive and stable and clear above all, truth above all, is much more important than the ephemeral forlorn world of organic life. And if in our design schools, for example, we've been taught to clear it up because it's messy, then the residue of that value surely is built into almost every tool, where you draw a NURB and it will resolve itself into a smoother curve. And why is it a smoother curve? Why is that tool doing that to me? Try and draw a multi-point line in Illustrator, for example, and have it retain the nuance and the expression of your original gesture. It's being corrected into something universal, into something homogenizing. So that's my first reaction, is that we need some different tools. But that's not to say that we don't need order. And so I want to be very careful in this. I just think that we need a much wider palette for the kind of ambivalence and the hovering quality. I'd love to be able to greatly expand out the kind of spectrum around precarity. And perhaps a popular word for that is the edge of chaos, where humans seem to like to live, and where life lives too, according to physics in the last 50 years. Does that make sense as a kind of a provisional answer?
Yeah.
Well, colleagues, thank you so very much for today. Lisa, thanks for a great presentation. I loved listening to you speak. Each of you is asked to work rather hard in the next day and a half, please. I hope that it'll be okay to do quite an energetic assembly and to share that with us on Thursday. I'll ask you to include, please, a little presentation of your own, so that each of you can just represent projects that you've been doing. It'll just be a couple of minutes each, and I apologize for that. That's because really want everyone to have a forum, and then we're going to be looking at your material more. And I will try to do a bit more of a lecture on Thursday, just to round things out as well. And I totally agree, Maricel. Lisa's drawings are unbelievable. All right, colleagues, thanks so much for another great session.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.